Hey everyone, hope you're doing well. We're going to be revisiting the Fragment and Aspect tier list today in Renegades. It's been a while since we've touched on these, and the Fragment tier list, I haven't touched it too much. It hasn't changed that much, but the Aspect tier list has been transformed quite a bit, and I think is a lot more indicative of like sandbox analysis that we tend to do on this channel a lot. So we're going to breeze through the Fragment tier list a little quickly, just go through some highlights that I want to point out, maybe some big changes, big swings, and then I'll go over like what the tiers kind of mean in this tier list, and then we'll just move on to the Aspect tier list, right? So Fragment tier list, before we get started, so S tier is like extreme regen or survivability or damage effects. I think that's pretty straightforward, right? You have stuff like starvation for survivability, benevolence for like ability regen, and then for damage, you have stuff like courage, right? So pretty self-explanatory there. A tier, we have like strong neutral effects, vigilance, resistance, protection, singeing, your classics, right? You have some ability regen stuff, but it's like a little situational. You have B tier, which is like powerful build-specific effects and timer extensions. So powerful build-specific effects, that's stuff like beacons, ashes, char. Kind of have to play into these playstyles a little bit more. And then you have stuff like durance, solace, timer extensions, right? Next in the C tier, we have quality of life and situational build-specific effects. So quality of life is going to be stuff like ascent and impetus and command, right? Reload effects, quality of life effects. You have some situational build-specific effects. These are going to be things like blessing, mending, resolve, gunpowder gamble build, stuff like that, where you have to build a little bit more into these things, a little bit more situational in terms of like when you would actually benefit from these fragments. And then next in the D tier, we have positive but kind of unneeded or not very noticeable effects in PvE. So I'm talking about stuff like Echo of Cessation, right? Void Breach on Volatile Kill. You could use this on like volatile builds, but it's not as noticeable as some of the stuff in the C and the B tier. Reprisal, a little bit more niche as well. Bravery, instability, propagation, these effects like volatile and unraveling rounds, not as treasured as they once were, right? Then you have the E tier. E tier is like very niche stuff. Stuff like Echo of Exchange, given like the melee kill cost. You have Ember of Combustion, pretty niche. Echo of Domineering, you can use that on like a Wave Splitter build, but that's pretty niche. Ember of Tempering, Facet of Defiance, pretty niche stuff, right? And then finally, we have the F tier, which in my opinion, these fragments, you could, in theory, benefit from them in PvE, but in my opinion, these fragments lack application in PvE, like, Whisper of Reversal, stuff like Threat of Finality. It's just like, why would you ever take these fragments, pretty much? Okay? And then before we move on to aspects, I'm going to go over a couple highlights here that maybe change position, or maybe something in the sandbox has changed to make them more powerful. Okay? So there's 4 fragments here I want to talk about. Number 1 is Echo of Vigilance. I had this a lot lower on this tier list before because I was under the impression that it didn't really kick in when you needed it, and the internal cooldown was kind of annoying. The Void River Shield wasn't that helpful. That was wrong. Okay, I've played this on Contra, on Void Warlock, a subclass that famously lacks DR, and this definitely kicks in when you need it, and you definitely notice it. It definitely saves your life. And so because of that, that's just a pretty solid effect. I think any subclass would really like to have this fragment. So I'm going to go ahead and put it at the top of A tier. I don't think it's as gameplay defining as a lot of the stuff in the S tier, which is like completely gameplay warping, maybe with the exception of like generation. But yeah, it's pretty good. Pretty good. Echo Vigilance. Next up, we have Facet of Dominance, which is right under it, as well as Spark of Shock to some degree. Obviously, Arc Soul counts as Arc Grenade damage now, which has completely changed how good Getaway Artist is. Just being able to jolt on hit repeatedly without even having to shoot anything is insane. And Facet of Dominance, as a result, because it's enabled that playstyle and made Getaway as meta as it is going to be kind of close to the top of A tier. Next, we have Ember of Char, which I believe is in the B tier. I just put it right next to Ember of Ashes because I think their build crafting potential in terms of just, scaling around ignitions and playing around ignitions, getting them faster and having them spread, they're pretty similar in terms of their viability. They help a lot with that kind of build. I guess Ember of Ashes is more like single target focused and Ember of Char is more like spread build focused, but I think they're similar in viability. So I moved Ember of Char to be up next to its friend Ember of Ashes. And then finally, we have Facet of Generosity, which we've been using a little bit in speedrunning recently. If you ever need to have some sort of super chaining strategy in your team, and I know prismatic fragment slots tend to be pretty crowded, but if you have space for Facet of Generosity, you just need to get like a couple kills while you're transcendent, and you get 4 large orbs. These are super orbs, basically. So they are like around 7% super, so it's like a quarter of a super for like everyone on your team. So I know I didn't place it very high because it is kind of a niche effect, but the effect is pretty cool and it's pretty easy to activate compared to some of the other prismatic stuff. So, I thought I'd shout it out. Pretty cool fragment for team play, but obviously if you're solo or if you're not coordinated, maybe not the best. Okay, so that's it for the fragment tier list. Let's get into the fun stuff, which is of course the aspect tier list. Okay, the aspect tier list has been completely redone from top to bottom. We have the S tier all the way down to the D tier. Actually, we don't have down to the E and the F tier like we do fragments. because there's only 57 aspects, not too many. Let's start by talking about the S tier. I'm going to go straight down from the S tier, and I'm going to talk about stuff that maybe is not as obvious, right? Stuff like Feed the Void, pretty obvious why it's rank 1, right? You have 200 HP on activation, right? Unnerf Devour, crazy stuff, crazy for survivability. Don't need to talk too much about that, right? But let's talk about the stuff that you might not expect to be in certain tiers. So first we have Tempest Strike. Tempest Strike, I haven't tested this myself, but this is compendium data and I trust them. 75% DR, that's not a generic resist source, by the way, so you can use it with stuff like Gifted Conviction, with stuff like Smoke Jumper, and it stacks. 75% DR for 4 seconds after usage. The fact that you can pair this with Combination Blow means that you can essentially have this DR active all the time. And Tempest Strike fixes a lot of the issues with Combination Blow, which is like on contest, being melee range with stuff like phalanxes, right? With stuff like, any enemy where like melee hit rate can become an issue. Combination Blow loses consistency points for that. That's why a lot of people prefer to not use Combination Blow in contest environments, even though it has, more potency in terms of orb gen, in terms of being able to nuke majors. It's not as consistent, right? So people run like Ascension Spectre or stuff like that. Tempest Strike kind of fixes this issue. I think if Tempest Strike was on Prismatic, people would tend to take it more, right? So Tempest Strike, jolting uppercut on slide melee, that's pretty nice, pairs well with Gifted. You can pair with other exotics as well, though. Just pretty solid overall. I think it's a pretty, like the DR number is just, mind-boggling. That's a mind-boggling DR number. So I kind of had to give it S tier. Controlled Demolition, another one that's kind of flown under the radar a little bit because Void Titan is just not that popular right now for obvious reasons. This is one of the reasons why, like, a lot of the time aspects can define why you take a subclass, right? For example, the difference between like Prismatic and Arc Hunter. It can be aspects, it can be supers, it can be a bunch of different reasons. And, while aspects do define more of your playstyle than fragments, and they do impact what subclass you choose more than fragments, you're still locked to supers sometimes. You're still locked to certain things sometimes. And so Controlled Demolition is one of those examples where like you have Bubble, you have Banner Shield, which is not that relevant right now. Bubble is certainly not very relevant right now. And then you have Twilight Arsenal, which you can also pick on Prismatic, which, is a lot more versatile than Void Titan. So Controlled Demolition, because of that, has probably flown under the radar for a lot of people for quite some time. But let's talk about this thing's effects. So Volatile Explosions restore 90 HP to allies within 40 meters. I'm pretty sure this is of the explosion and not of you. If it's of you, that's insane. But like if it's of the explosion, 40 meters is a long distance, right? That's a very, very long distance. Volatile Explosions do have a cooldown after the funnel web incident, back in the day when Witch Queen first came out. But even if they have an internal cooldown, this is short enough that you can be spamming basically 90 HP pulses to people constantly, right? And on top of this, a lot of chunk healing effects are based on kills. You have stuff like Devour, you have stuff like, Cure from On Your Mark, you have Combination Blow, Knockout. All of these are like on kill. Volatile Explosions are not on kill. These are on hit. These are on hit. You can spam them on a volatile target. And this is ignoring the first half of this aspect here. Void ability damage and Volatile Explosions themselves apply further volatile to nearby targets, which is like, that's crazy. That's pretty good too. People know this Controlled Demolition aspect as like the spread volatile disease to all the ads kind of aspect. But the second effect is crazy, and the first effect is also crazy. And when you put them together, it's excellent with stuff like Destabilizing Choir. So I think this is just one of the strongest, if not the strongest, sustained chunk healing in the game. 90 HP on just Volatile Explosion ICD, and it's not tied to like Cure ICD either. So it's like, it's its own thing, which is pretty strong. You have Winter Shroud, which I guess you might be surprised to see here. 50% DR for 4 seconds on dodge. Dodge is like more passive, I guess, than, using Tempest Strike and having to get sort of within melee range of enemies or having to deal with terrain and stuff like that. Dodge, you can basically keep this up pretty much all the time. The slow doesn't even have to be from your dodge. 4 times class regen basically means that you can have this up all the time. And on top of that, I think a little underrated aspect of Winter Shroud is that it applies courage to anything that you want to melee if you have Facet of Courage on at a red bar level, right? A lot of the time, it's pretty easy to darkness debuff a boss using stuff that's not Winter Shroud because people are thinking about it. But when we're just thinking about like red bars, you're often not darkness debuffing them. And then of course with Winter Shroud, you can freeze a lot of targets fairly easily as well, which makes your melees more potent. If you guys play Titan with Knockout or if you play Hunter with Winter Shroud, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Banner of War, I'll give a little brief note here. Stronghold Central, shout out to them. They found that Banner of War gives a 20% buff instead of a 10% buff to sword damage. Now, however, this was further tested and it was found that this is only to the Banner of War user, okay? The teammates that are in the Banner of War, they still only get a 10% sword damage buff. Now, for the survivability aspect, this probably would have been like A tier, but with the sword damage, with the melee damage increase, with all of those things tied in, this is the only aspect in the game that gives a stackable weapon damage boost, even if it's to swords only. Swords are pretty strong right now, and good sustain as well to your teammates. So yeah, pretty easy S tier for me. If it was 20% to all of your teammates as well, this would probably be placed even a little bit higher here, because that would make swords significantly more meta, but still pretty cool. Still pretty cool stuff, right? We have Ascension. Yeah, I rated Ascension pretty low the last time we made this tier list, like a year ago or something like that. I have since obviously changed my opinions. I mean, since then, I believe Amplified has also received like DR changes and stuff like that. But 100% team-wide Amplified uptime, which is excellent during boss damage phases, or even just helping your teammates during an encounter. You have Jolt synergy with stuff like Gifted Conviction. You have the fact that the air move now consumes your class ability and actually uses the class ability's effects for the most part. There's still some stuff that doesn't work, right? Which we might see fixed in the future. But for the most part, it does, consume your class ability and actually act like you use your class ability, which is really, really helpful. And it's also an air move, so you can kind of dodge projectiles and get out of a bad situation to some degree using Ascension. So pretty cool stuff. One of the strongest examples of a you gotta feel it kind of aspect, or you gotta feel it kind of gameplay loop, where it's like you'll understand why it's so strong when you start using it, that kind of thing, right? Soul Invictus, we've talked about this before, but Sunspot spam with Restoration Access, staggering ticks on adds passive ability regen, just like everything but the kitchen sink is in this one. And then we have Knockout, which is like pseudo Devour for Titans, and you have free Amplified, universal melee damage boost, just pretty strong overall on Titan. Feels very consistent to activate compared to some of the other survivability aspects. And then let's talk about A tier. So A tier, you have Weave Walk, I think pretty still underrated kind of to some degree. This is the aspect that enables Strand Warlock being a consistent option in contest level content. Now, granted, its super is still a little lacking compared to stuff like Curus Nighthawk. Metiodoxia does still need like a small buff in my opinion for Strand Warlock to be more meta. But besides that, it is very strong. 90% DR. I think the horizontal movement aspect is also underrated and something that you should not overlook. In contests, there's a lot of environments where like you want to horizontally move from one space to another quickly to go do a mechanic or whatever. And this is a really great way to do that. Just tapping your melee, just getting that little Weave Walk skate boost, and then you kind of drop it right after. And you get a little bit of Woven Mail as well. It's just excellent. You give it to your teammates too. Yeah, it's just a very versatile aspect. Excellent response strategy. Probably the best panic button in the game when it comes to responding to, oh crap, I'm low. There's a lot of stuff in contest where you will literally out heal damage on Weave Walk. Like you have so much DR in Weave Walk that stuff tries to damage you and you will just, your health bar won't move and you'll start regenning because of how little damage you're taking. So that's a little funny tidbit about Weave Walk. Consecration, this is just an intangible. Yeah, pretty strong stuff. Stylish, I moved it down from the S tier this season because like I say here, the invisibility aspect is just not as high value anymore. You see a lot of people taking Spectre Ascension because the name of the game on Hunter these days tends to be, let's run Amplified, let's run Threaded Spectre so the ads aren't even shooting me, and then let's run like Hoyle Cert, and let's just have Woven Mail perma. Let's have, I don't know, if you're on Squall, you can have like Frost Armor perma on top of that. Let's have Faceted Protection. Let's have all these DR sources, and then invisibility doesn't even matter at that point. And, at that point, you don't even need kills, right? It's just about spamming your ability loop. And when you get to that point, Stylish Executioner, like the kill requirement is like a slight disadvantage compared to stuff like Ascension Spectre. And of course, the melee damage bonus, you see people use it in some solos when they, tether ads and they try to get Stylish procs repeatedly to boost their melee damage a little bit more. But that's kind of a situational thing, right? So not as gameplay defining as the stuff in the S tier. Moving down the line here, we have stuff like On Your Mark, which was recently changed. Cure on kill at 10 stacks. It is tied to the Cure internal cooldown, but that's pretty short, and I think it's enough to kind of classify this like a pseudo Devour effect for Solar Hunter. Still lacks DR, but the effect itself is pretty decent. And of course, the 50 weapons boost, as well as some of the quality of life reload stuff for your teammates in Fireteam environments, especially I would say 6-man environments, is actually a sizable, noticeable boost. 50 weapons is not insignificant and allows your team to focus more on getting like 200 super, 150 weapons, and then they would have effectively 200 of both stats if you're willing to run a Solar Hunter in your team, which I think is fairly strong. So I've decided to place it in the A tier. You have Gunpowder Gamble, Storm's Keep, not an S tier aspect. Some people think it is. It's nice, but Bolt Charge is the damage increase on a lot of weapon types is not as much as a lot of people think. And it's very one-dimensional in its use case. There's a lot of stuff in the S tier, think like Soul Invictus, that's super, super versatile and affects every aspect of your gameplay. Storm's Keep is really just kind of a damage increase. Yes, it has some neutral aspects where you can sit behind the barricade, but a lot of the things that you get out of a Storm's Keep rally barricade, people are conflating with just a rally barricade. Rally barricades in general are very strong. They're very good for just sitting behind, reducing 80% of the splash damage that's incoming, but regular rally barricades do that, right? So Storm's Keep, it's really just the Bolt Charge build. And that effect, it's like okay, right? You get a little bit of like melee regen and stuff like that, but it's really not that strong, right? Maybe in the future we'll see it pair with like trickle charge rockets or trickle charge GLs or something in the future. But for now, I think Storm's Keep, I think A tier is a totally fair placement for it. You have Into the Fray, Lethal Current, which were here last time, not going to talk about those. And then in the B tier, I mean, I don't think there's really any surprises here. You have stuff like Touch of Flame, Touch of Thunder, which modify potentially gameplay changing or like strong damage options for grenades. You have Roaring Flames, Lightning Surge, which is like a less consistent version of like Consecration, stuff like that. You have Mind Spun Invocation, which is seeing some more use these days. Grapple Melee making 3 Threadlings is like the fastest Threadling spam in the game. You also have Suspend Synergy with stuff like Deimos Diffusion. So, Mind Spun is seeing some use because of Weaver's Trance. That's definitely an option. Ice Flare Bolts has always been like a strong aspect. I moved it down a little bit, I think, compared to like the first iteration of this tier list, because even though the raw effect is good, it does have an internal cooldown, and CC is just not as useful as it used to be these days. So, Ice Flare Bolt's pretty strong CC spread, but, B tier. Whirling Maelstrom is quite underrated, in my opinion, by a lot of people. The ad clear and the stagger effect that it has on like big groups of enemies is actually pretty strong, I would say. The damage that this kind of unraveling vortex does to large groups of enemies is actually a little bit underrated. And it's kind of passive as well, right? You kind of make these tangles all the time by just playing Strand Hunter, or, let's theorize that this was on Prismatic or something like that. You could get these pretty frequently, and they're kind of like a nice set and forget kind of turret sort of playstyle, except a little bit more active and a little bit more ad clear focused and less on CC. So, I think if it wasn't tied to Strand Hunter, maybe more people would use it. But, regardless, pretty cool stuff. You have Hellion and Bleak Watcher, which are both kind of similar. They're, as I wrote here, helps soften targets in the way that Hellion does, right? They're kind of just there to, you set them, you forget them, and Hellion really exists to help Solar Warlock actually do ad clear with ignitions, and Bleak Watcher kind of just exists because you are able to run Getaway and make a stasis turret every time you eat your Arcanade. That is most of the reason why people choose to run Bleak Watcher. I think if you had to choose between one or the other, people definitely wouldn't run Bleak Watcher. Like if, for example, you were on Getaway Artist and it didn't make a Bleak Watcher, if you chose to consume like an Arc Grenade, then I think people definitely like wouldn't use Bleak Watcher. But it's not too bad, and it's definitely like a reliable CC option from like the days of Beyond Light when people used to like spam these with like Osmio or like Eye of Another World and stuff like that. Weaver's Call, this the class energy on Threadling hit makes this a lot nicer, and of course the perch Threadlings that are just being generated while you're doing damage. Not as much of a damage increase as you might think, but it is passive damage. It does exist. I think on Strand Warlock there are other higher priority aspects to take. For example, I think you might run like Mind Spun and like Weave Walk instead for like a contest environment, but certainly the passive damage is not bad. And a lot of people that swapped, for example, from Solar Warlock to Prismatic Warlock in this past day one to build up like a super for burst, they definitely ran like Weaver's Call to get that class energy back using Phoenix Dive, as well as to build Darkness Transcendence. We have Fleshit Storm, which definitely fell off a little bit after that kind of original 5 feet Desert Perpetual, where people were cooking with like Apotheosis Song of Flame and stuff like that. Damage has been nerfed. And of course, Fleshit Storm is, you kind of have to take Banner and Fleshit Storm together if you want maximum damage, which means you're dropping Into the Fray, which means you're dropping a lot of potential melee regen. And of course, as an aspect itself, the animation is like cool and you get like a little bit of DR, but I think Consecration is a lot more efficient in my opinion when it comes to how much melee energy am I expending and how many adds am I killing. I think Consecration is the clear winner there. You have Ionic Sentry, which I think I underrated in past iterations. Now, granted, it's recently received like a synergy buff with stuff like Spark of Shock because it counts as Arc Grenade damage now, so you can boost it with like Verity or Grenadier or 200 Grenade, whatever grenade increases you have. And so that definitely helps it out a little bit. And Ionic Sentry, I think the blind effect is actually not too bad. It lasts a fair amount of time. It kind of reminds me of like a mix between a Bleak Watcher because it has some CC aspects to it, and maybe like a Gunpowder Gamble because it has like a little bit of ad clear aspect to it when it comes to having Spark of Shock. So it's kind of like a good mix between the two, with like the whole 6 stack effect that you need to fulfill in order to have the Ionic Sentry pop out. So yeah, not too bad. I honestly think it's an underrated aspect as well. We have Diamond Lance, which is good for getting some Frost Armor in some cases on Titan where you can't be as aggressive and run Consecration. You have Unbreakable, which is honestly like a pretty strong aspect. It's one of the best get out of jail cards in the game, comparable to Weave Walk, but unfortunately it's tied to a longer cooldown. Weave Walk, the nice thing about it is that you can repeatedly activate and reactivate it as long as you have at least 1 charge. Whereas Unbreakable, unless you run Armamentarium, you only have 1 charge to begin with. And so once you use it up, even if you block a lot of damage and like you release and you hit a bunch of ads, you're not going to get all of your grenade back. And so you are definitely going to have like a moment where you're a little bit vulnerable. Whereas with Weave Walk, if you have good cooldown management, you definitely always have that get out of jail free card. Then we have Vanishing Step, which is like just increases your dodge length and makes you invisible, just like a decent get out of jail free card as well. Next, we have the C tier. Ensnaring Slam, I think, is also a little bit underrated. I know this is the second lowest tier, but I think it's still a little bit underrated because you can get up to 20 seconds of Woven Mail by hitting 5 targets with this thing. I don't know if you get in-flight DR. It would be nice if you got in-flight DR because you're diving into the middle of a bunch of ads. Unfortunately, suspension is not as relevant in the sandbox these days, which is kind of why this is in the C tier, but it's, top of C tier, not too bad. We have Tectonic Harvest, which is the best of the Stasis Harvest aspects, as I'm sure you know. Stasis Titan is the best maintainer of Frost Armor and the best maintainer of Stasis Shard Collection. So yeah, that's kind of why this is top of C tier. You have Arc Soul. Now I know Arc Souls are very prominent now because of Getaway Artist, but the actual aspect itself is definitely overshadowed by other things. And the fact that Getaway Artist can function without the actual Arc Soul aspect is kind of why Getaway Artist is so good, right? You can exchange having to use your exotic slot for an entire aspect, right? So a lot of the time, people will run Getaway Artist and not run Arc Soul. They won't run Arc Soul even on Arc. They'll replace it with like something else because you don't need Arc Soul, right? The only effect that this gives to you is, of course, the class regen near allies, which can be helpful with stuff like Vesper. Don't get me wrong, it's like a cool effect, but the actual Arc Soul aspect itself, and not the buddy that we're talking about here, is definitely like overshadowed by Getaway Artist. And the damage benefit, I know a lot of people have thought about using the Arc Soul aspect on Arc Warlock to share Arc Souls to their teammates and create a lot of jolts. Jolt has a 1 second internal cooldown, and Arc Soul, when you're solo, kind of already meets that requirement if you're amplified. And so the damage benefit isn't really that substantial in full teams, and not really worth running an Arc Warlock in my opinion. But I don't know, the changes to like Storm Dancer's Brace and stuff like that maybe will change my mind by the time we get around to the next day 1 race where we're talking about team comps. You have Bastion, which is just sustain stuff, Knock him down, which enables Solar Hunter knife play, even though the knives are not that strong, I suppose. Electrostatic Mind, which allows you to empower Arc Warlock a lot more in terms of ability cycling. Widow's Silk, which unfortunately, it was disabled this last day 1 race, but the grapples, kind of making grapple points thing and enabling your teammates to have temporary grapples is kind of a cool gimmick, but it's not like insanely crazy. It's mostly, this is an aspect for Surturacne being essentially infinite Woven Mail, guaranteed Woven Mail all the time while you're playing Strand Hunter, as well as being an option to create grapple points in a rather forgiving manner to your teammates when you are grapple meleeing bosses as a team. You have Grim Harvest, which is a little bit worse than Tectonic Harvest because, you can't just break crystals and get free shards from them. You have to get them off of stasis debuff kills, which is a little bit more annoying. You have Howl the Storm, which is a good option to be able to transform an otherwise not very useful melee in the form of Shiver Strike into a bunch of crystals. So it's basically like, now that you have 2 stasis melee charges, you can make 2 extra Glacier Grenades, essentially, which is really, really nice on Stasis Titan. Chaos Accelerant, the reason why this one is not in the same tier as like Touch of Flame and Touch of Thunder is none of the Void Nades on Void Warlock are like super gameplay defined. I know there's chunking right now, but ignoring that, right? Because that's obviously a bug, which will be fixed. They're not as high impact as some of the stuff like Touch of Flame Healing Nade, or Touch of Flame Fusion Nade, or Touch of Flame Solar Nade, or for example, like Touch of Thunder Storm Nade, Touch of Thunder Pulse Nade. The effects that Chaos Accelerant imparts on these Void Nades is not as potent as some of the stuff that I think is on Touch of Flame and Touch of Solar. And sometimes you don't even run like Chaos Accelerant. For example, if you run Nothing Manacles, a lot of people don't run Chaos Accelerant because you get the effect by default. And you can just run a different aspect instead, and Nothing Manacles is probably the strongest non-chunk related Void Warlock build. Outside of just maybe you can also just run Contra normally as well, but that's up for debate. A couple other things here, Child of the Old Gods for debuff extension, Trapper's Ambush for like Void Invis, like stealth scenarios, Heat Rises for movement related stuff, and also like, you can technically get 2 times restoration from Phoenix Diving, but that's not really relevant anymore post Empyrean nerf. You have Offensive Bulwark, but kind of an awkward balance when it comes to aspect selection on Void Titan. And one of the main problems with this aspect is that, you kind of have uptime issues because when your Void Overshield gets stripped, this aspect becomes essentially useless, which in contest or like high level content, your Void Overshield is often getting shredded. Next, we have Shatter Dive, which I think I've lifted a tier because you do get Frost Armor on Crystal or Enemy Shatter, which makes this a lot more similar to something like a Titan on Tectonic Harvest. So I think Shatter Dive is pretty nice in that respect. You have Touch of Winter, which, the effect is kind of nice, I guess, for renewal like Duskfield. Yeah, it's an extremely one-dimensional aspect. You take it for one reason and one reason only. I do think Touch of Winter Cold Snaps are like a little bit underrated, I think. But still, not going to save this from the C tier, that's for sure. On the Prowl, this is just too inconsistent of an aspect to use in endgame content. You have to walk over to a specific target and into its cloud, and then the effect that this gives you, which is like Old Heart of the Pack, is not as potent and lasts 7 seconds. So yeah, 7 seconds. I mean, to be getting these like multi-kills, like this kind of Lorentz quest gameplay over and over and over in a, endgame scenario, not really relevant. Flow state is cool. You get 66% DR during your dodge while amplified. It's like kind of like shimmering dodge that you do. But like during your dodge, you generally don't need DR, and I don't think it lingers either. And so there's obviously other aspects in this game that give you a lot of lingering DR, Winter Shroud, Tempest Strike. And the DR can be like even higher in some cases too, right? So the class regen is kind of nice. You can run this, but I don't think it's a super important aspect or a super gameplay warping aspect like some of the other ones we talked about. Icarus Dash, I know, tragedy, it's in the C tier, but really this is mostly just a quality of life movement choice. If Solar Warlock had better access to better aspects that were, you know, DR focused or survivability focused more, I think people would not run Icarus Hellion, but a lot of top Warlock players are basically just running Icarus Hellion because that's what you get. That's what you're dealing with. So there's that. Glacial Harvest, easily the worst harvest aspect out of the three. This one only makes stasis shards near enemies when you freeze them completely, and apparently still has an internal cooldown. I haven't tested this, but the compendium says this still has a 10-second internal cooldown after like 6 shards, which is weird. I know there is a global stasis shard cooldown now for like the other harvest aspects, but I don't know if this is like a different one. I'm not sure what's going on here, but a 10-second internal cooldown kind of sucks after just 6 shards, so I'm assuming this is not the same universal cooldown that the others share. And then finally in the D tier, we have a bunch of aspects. Drenger's Lash without a ban is pretty terrible in terms of aspect efficiency, especially when you consider that Into the Fray and Banner of War are on the same subclass. Like, that's pretty bad. Juggernaut is basically PvP only, in my opinion. I mean, I think that's fairly obvious. The Overshield is nice, and the DR is nice, but the fact that you fully deplete your class ability on destruction, and then you have to wait for your entire class ability to come back before you get it again, yeah, terrible uptime in PvE. Don't think I need to say much. The Wanderer, this can honestly make Tangles more annoying rather than less annoying because they have a delayed detonation, and I don't know, they're kind of weird, I suppose. Kind of a personal preference thing, but I really don't think the Wanderer has much use in endgame PvE. And then finally, you have Frost Pulse, which does almost nothing outside of like maybe Balador's Wrathweaver's usage, and which I'm not really considering because this is just the individual aspect. And then Cryoclasm, which is for sliding further in PvP, and maybe some PvE challenges, but that's really it. So yeah, that's it for the aspect tier list. I hope you guys enjoyed this little discussion of the meta. We definitely have some crazy strong aspect effects that I have revisited this time around and given a more thorough review of. And yeah, tomorrow we're going to be doing the subclass tier list, which I'm still working on because it is very annoying. But once we get the scoring system and the images in order, that should be done. And then we'll move on to more fun content. And yeah, we'll have a good rest of this DLC. Goodbye for now, and I hope you guys have a great day.